We have an enormously interesting session which took place in Canada also. It's called But Where Exactly is Home? And on stage we have Amanthi Harris, novelist from London, Ganeshananthan, Ganeshananthan, who's just written a book called Brotherless Night, which is, I think, winning some awards, am I right? Has won something. She's very modest, she won't tell you. You check out for yourself. Ronya Othmann, who has won many awards and is kind of a superstar on the festival circuit. And don't be shy of me. And our very own Marguerite Richards, who I have called an author-in-exile, but she's not. That kind of makes it sound like she's been booted out of America because she is American. No, she chooses to be in Sri Lanka, but she loves America too. Over to you, Marguerite.
Thank you very much. We're very happy to be here, and it's nice to see the turnout. So we're going to be talking about home, and we're going to speed past the introductions because it's such a meaty topic. There's so many things to talk about. And what I really wanted to do before we talk about leaving home is to define what home is, because it's actually quite a nebulous topic and something we don't really think about, especially if you've been living in only one place for most of your life. And this is the case of these writers, they've moved around a whole lot, and so it's an interesting concept. I'm going to read a little short passage to think about that definition of the word home from my book, The Ordinary Chaos of Being Human. It's a compilation of short memoir by authors from all over the world on love, loss, and longing. And most of these writers have lived very migratory lives. So in every story, they're discussing that feeling of what is it to define home. So this author, he's Kay Eltene, and he wrote a story called Nostos Algos, which loosely translates to nostalgia, or more precisely, I think something like returning home and sort of that ache of the feeling of returning home. And I thought that was a beautiful idea. So in order to talk about his what home means to him in Nostos Algos, he talks about a series of events that happened in his childhood, and that brings him to one point where he's writing this story. He says, 30 odd years later, I still sweat with this fever, a condition known as nostalgia that once discharged soldiers from the war. In the middle of the night has become a ritual, that my lover curls her back against my hands, and I return to that living room that no longer exists, to the laughter of my parents in the car after I tried to tip the fruit vendor in Kovar, to the principal who only saw violence in words and not actions. The tension disappears in each of her muscles like the stones that I flung in the Rhine River with the impetus of my youth, bringing back leisurely afternoons dripping like coconut jam from my child lips in Singapore. As my hands pass over her skin, I think about the hidden milieus that we collectively share but only value for their differences. Identically colorful as those rosaries, the misbahas, as they're called in Turkey, used for zikir, to remember, but known in Greece as kapalos, to bury worries and to forget. I guess home gave me shelter in a few neat languages, a kitchen where I still drizzle honey over sliced banana and cheese in the morning to fight off the ache of maybe today and maybe tomorrow. So you can see, for him, home is a series of acts and involved with people, but they're moments in time. And I think that it shows, this is a beautiful poetic prose passage that really shows the complexity of what home can mean for a lot of people. So I have asked these wonderful authors who become my friends, some of the course of the last few days, to choose passages in which their books have, they have written what home means to their protagonists or define home in some way through a passage in their books. I'm sure that there's many passages in the books, but they chose just one. And one of the most beautiful things, and that's a coincidence also, is that each of the passages they chose, it talks about people and the relationship the protagonist has to someone else, which defines home. So I think we'll start, I was going to switch this up a little bit so we can sort of deepen the conversation and make it juicy and exciting for these writers. And we'll start with Sugi. We'll start with Sugi, and Sugi's, sorry, I'm switching up. No, change the order, yeah, sorry about that. But the same passage, but just change the order. It's on, I think, already, no? Test. Ah, it is. So actually it's Vivi Ganeshananthan, but she's also known as Sugi. And the passage in her book is actually quite an intense moment in the book. But it brings across that emotion of home that is really, really so beautiful.
So this is from my new novel, which is called Brotherless Night. Thank you all for coming. What a nice, large, lovely crowd. It's a joy to me. This is my first ever event in Colombo, so thank you for being here. And this is a story that is told from the first person point of view of a woman in her middle age who is recalling from the vantage point of 2009 her teenage years growing up in a Tamil family in Jaffna. So I'll just give you just the context you need for this particular passage. She is the fourth of 5 children. She is the only sister. And this is at a point in the war when there isn't necessarily current in Jaffna. So one of her brothers earlier had given her kind of a smuggled bottle of kerosene that she could use to study. And the other thing, the brothers are named Niranjan, Dialan, Ceylon, and Aaron. They have a friend who lives near them named Kay, and they have a dog named Henry. And at the beginning of this passage, someone in the Tigers has come to relieve them of their house. For how long do you think you will need the house? Amma asked nervously. He gestured extravagantly, arms sweeping wide. Who thought the war would go on in this way, for this long, he said. We can promise that you will return. After all, we are fighting to defend your ancestral home. Until we attain liberation, we will provide housing for you, and we will help you to go. Because it was not a request, we will help you to go, Aaron repeated witheringly when I told him. We consented. We packed our own things, declining the help of the cotters who showed up on moving day. Aaron sorted through Niranjan's possessions, and Amma packed Ceylon's things. I organized Dialan's 2-quiet room into a single large suitcase because Amma could not bear to do it. The kerosene bottle that he had given me was dry, but I put it in my school bag anyway. I swept the books off of his shelf and into the suitcase. I wished I could pack the green of the trees, the gate he had unlatched, the bicycle he had lost so long ago. I felt myself emptying, along with the house. We yielded what we had collected to the cotters who loaded our worldly goods into a lorry. We went behind them in a hired auto so that we could follow them to a place and a house that we had never seen before. Even as we pulled away from the small, dear lane, I could see more cotters walking up the veranda steps. I could imagine them exploring the garden and exclaiming at the beauty of the small courtyard. They would strip the house, certainly, and if they did not, others would. They would walk across the veranda where my oldest brother, Niranjan, had shared his medical textbooks, the courtyard where my youngest brother, Aaron, had read the newspaper, the dirt patch by the gate where my middle brothers, Ceylon and Dialan, and their friend Kay, had wielded their cricket bats. I tried to remember if I had taken Niranjan's medical school graduation photo down, if I had put his portrait and Dialan's portrait among our things, or were they still on the wall in our house, which was now theirs? In my lap, Henry cried openly, as only dogs can. Thank you.
I love this passage because you're talking about objects, but particularly how the people are related to these objects and how the people serve those actions. So tell us about how that is defining the relationship with home.
I think in this book, the characters move frequently. The experience of displacement is common to many Sri Lankans and certainly common in the Tamil community during this time period. So one of the things that happens is that some objects in the book become symbols of home. They travel from one location to the other. Sometimes a character will give another character a gift, and the recipient will carry the gift with them. So those objects become kind of trackers for a little bit where home is. And when they're lost, I think that's often something that has a lot of emotional impact.
Amanthi, in your book, Beautiful Place, you are talking about, the book is really about home and creating home in general. The entire book is about that, right? And you'll read to us a passage that describes that feeling in relation to people also.
Hi everyone. I'm going to read from Beautiful Place, and it's about a villa on the southern coast, sort of near Tengel. It's an imaginary village, and it's about an Austrian architect who builds a villa in the style of old Sri Lankan houses and adopts a child. And it's this child that, in the end, makes home for him. And through the book, he kind of comes to realize that it's the child rather than the actual house that has meant home for him. So I thought I would read that little section. Gerhardt woke from an afternoon nap to a room rosy and glowing, a flare of sun caught in a rose-pink and orange band of the curtains. There was a smell of jasmine oil, sweet and joyful and sickly. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Then he remembered. He was in Padma's room at the villa. He had offered to run the guest house while Padma was in Colombo. He had longed as a young man to be stirred by the places he stayed in, and to make places that would stir the hearts of others. It was important, he had sensed, even then, to live and work in beauty, to live life gladly, owning every hour, every day, year after year. He sat on the edge of the bed and stretched, feeling the ache in his limbs, a new tension cramping his muscles. A gust of wind came in at the window and left, sucking the curtains ribbed against the window bars. Surely the jauntiest, kitschiest colour scheme ever conceived. These curtains, with their red, orange, lemon yellow, candy floss pink, and even a lime green stripe. But somehow it worked. That was the beauty of the design, and Padma had seen it. He thought back to the shopping trip at the famous Barefoot boutique in Colombo, seeing a younger Padma march straight past the more predictably coloured bolts of cloth, and straight for this. Caught in its cheery, cosy glow now, he was aware of how much the room felt of her, the happy eagerness that shone through her, that she would take everywhere she went. He felt her absence. Even in the years of her being at university, there had always been a sense of her still there, about to return. But the villa felt empty now, with a heavy new emptiness. The curtains blew in, released from the iron bars, lifting to reveal the ripening sun low over the garden. The afternoon, always a time for rest and reflection, had tipped over into the earliest edge of evening. The sunset still a promise in the deepening colours. Soon it would be time to watch the display, the day's brilliant achievement. This was the appeal of the tropics, the distinct phases of day, each broken into clear components, the parts defined by light and heat and the strength of breezes. In Europe, the day was a nebulous continuum, too short in winter, and in summer stretched to extraordinary lengths. Yet one was led guilelessly to believing those long, light evenings, only to be disappointed as the days shrank through autumn, and the bleakness of winter gravely took its place. Time passed so confusingly in Europe. No one quite knew where it went. A life could be over before you knew it.
Again, also a really wonderful last sentence that sort of leaves us wanting for more. Can you tell us a little bit about life being over before you know it, but in relation to home and the description of the villa, the Padma?
Well, that's always the fear, as a diasporic writer, you have this sense of two lives. So that amazing essay that you wrote, absolutely. There's an essay Suki wrote that she talks about this kind of a place in which you explore who you are and who you might have been, right? And that whole thing about, so you're really conscious of a life that you haven't yet had to live. So there is the desire to live as much as possible and as well as possible everywhere, and to create home everywhere you go and to try and capture something. So I think in Gerhard, I wanted to capture that, his eagerness to have a life that he had created, that he had built, that he could claim, was quite an important part of his character.
And for you, Ronya, you're in the summers, your book, The Summers, it's Layla's grandfather, who is ever present in the book, and so you've chosen a passage about him. Will you read it for us?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I have a short passage about Layla, my protagonist. She's growing up in a German Kurdish-Yazidi family, and she spends the summers at her grandparents' home in a Kurdish-Yazidi village in Syria next to the Turkish border. And this passage is about, remembering. In the very back corner of the garden, just in front of the fence behind which lay the fields, and behind those the mountain range and the Turkish frontier, grew her grandfather's tobacco plants. Every summer, Layla helped to harvest and thread the plants onto strings. She and her grandmother would hang them to dry in the pantry. Then in the evening, Layla would sit with her grandfather in the yard as he tried to teach her how to roll cigarettes. He took a rolling paper, laid in her little hands, and told her to take some tobacco out of the can and roll the paper with the tobacco in the middle back and forth between her fingers. Then fold the paper and moisten it at one side. He showed her that's the way to do it, and so forth. Bought tobacco for herself, went forth, but try as she might, she never succeeded. Only many years later, when she bought tobacco for herself the first time, did she suddenly remember those moments, the scratchy smell of the tobacco, her grandfather. She asked herself, she asked herself for the first time how her grandfather had still managed back then to roll his own cigarettes, even though he was blind. She thought about this as she laid the tobacco filter and paper in front of her on the table and practiced rolling. The first attempts were pitiful, and the cigarettes fell apart just like her stuffed grape leaves had. Had her grandfather put a filter in his cigarettes back then? Certainly not, she thought, but suddenly she was no longer so certain. No matter how hard she tried to remember, she just couldn't visualize it. She would never know it for sure. She had forgotten this one detail, the filter in her grandfather's cigarettes back then in the courtyard in the summers in the village. How could she have forgotten that?
So you actually have, you wrote this book after your grandfather's village. The idea was to set it in your actual grandfather's village, but yet you weren't actually able to go back there. So will you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was actually, as you know, there were 2011 to try, there was this protest, this revolution against the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, but he was so, like was fighting it so back so in a cruel way, and then the civil war started in Syria, and this village is a Yazidi village, which is a religious, like an ethnic and a religious minority, like Kurdish and Yazidi, because the main population of Syria is Arabic and also Sunni, like Muslim, and they're a little minority. And so I could not, it was difficult, I could not go back. Everyone tried to get out. And I started to write when I knew that this Yazidi life I knew before will no longer be there anymore. So there will be an end of the village life, but also like the Yazidi life we knew before. And then 2014, when ISIS attacked, so it was also the end. So then I started to write, and the loss also structured the memory somehow. And so I had my own memory, but I was a child when I was there, so it was not. I had the memory of my siblings, I had the memory of my family, of my father, so yeah, and also they started to tell stories in the diaspora when we lost everything somehow. Then they started to tell, so it was not just that I had to ask, but my father would tell my cousin old telling.
So it was a way, writing was sort of a way of laying claim, or just kind of taking the place for yourself, claiming your memory in a way.
No, yeah, more like also because it was not there anymore, so trying to preserve something or
Preserve it for yourself. Yeah.
Some little.
So in that same in that article that we discussed last time, Suki, you wrote an article about the diaspora, and I think that it was just beautifully, in a very vulnerable way, the way that you explored the idea of making something your own, but at the same time not having been there. And I don't know if you want to read this part or you want to just talk about it? Yeah.
So this is the essay that Amanthi was referring to before, and maybe connects some of these things. It appeared on a website called LitHub, if you're interested in reading the whole thing. And it was about researching from a diasporic position, essentially. As I considered writing about the war's early years, I asked myself how I could acknowledge the power of lived experience while simultaneously laying claim to my right to write about what I wanted. I could not assume I knew my material if that material was Sri Lanka itself. The answer, I thought, would lie in books and in other people. To write Brotherless Night, I attempted to throw a rope of research over an unbridgeable chasm with a river of doubt running steadily underneath. I had lived through the war in time and outside of it in space. And so I studied history the way a person of faith might have said a rosary, with belief and as a kind of penance. I had a guess about who I was and who I could have been, and set out to damn and verify myself. Someone with these goals may find no better terrain than fiction. To damn myself, how much did I not know? To verify myself, how much could I check? In both cases, oceans. I'll stop there.
I love this. I love this vulnerability of the rivers of doubt. I mean, that you're just attacking that head on. You know, what is yours, you know, and what are you allowed to write about, and how you can make it your own. Do you want to?
Well, I thought as I mentioned, the idea of exploring who you might have been is a huge part of our motivation as writers. I mean, maybe all writers, that's ultimately what we're doing. I mean, David Hare spoke in his talking in Candy about writers not necessarily being outsiders, but living one step aside from society, which I thought was a really interesting idea, not quite as lonely a place, really. a place where you can invent and observe and create for yourself the future that you might have had. And I mean, the minute we step from one life to another with a certain sort of rupture, there's that sort of traumatic moment of leaving something unnaturally early or without any control or without the power to choose. In my case, as a child, leaving a beloved home in Colombo, and so there is that rupture and there's that moment of trauma that is there as a little nugget of inspiration, I think, always, to try and reclaim it. And so that space is ours, and that's, in terms of home, that's the home we can take with us and recreate and explore, and our books, our homes, our everything is home in that sense.
I really love how you're the boss of it. There's nobody that gets to come and tell you how you define what home is. That it's such a unique, individual, subjective experience that only you can define. And so in your writing, tell me.
And I think also because of what you also mentioned, diasporic point of view, it's also like you have some kind of double, you live some kind of double life. It's always, also for my father, it's like, he has a garden in Germany, and he always tries to plant the garden they had in a village. So like one landscape is the absence of another, one place is the absence of another, and one life is, we have a life, but it's there, the other one is absent somehow. And that's also, I think, when there is violence, when it's not like a migration out of your own will, but your parents, they went because there was no other choice, that also plays a big role somehow. And so it's like, and I think also in this there lies some fiction, so because something is absent, and what is this absent home is somehow.
In my first novel, Love Marriage, I make a reference to, there's a market in Jaffna, and there's a version of that market in Toronto, which is constructed essentially, spatially, very close to, and the first time I heard about this, I was so excited. I was like, I can go to the same grocery store, but in Canada? That just sounds so wonderful. And what a strange and kind of gorgeous idea to make people happy in that way. So I wrote that essay in part because, and I would be curious to hear if the two of you have experienced this as well, but I think as a member of a diaspora, right, one of the reasons I'm so happy to see this crowd is, I get to talk to Sri Lankans, and so often in the United States, in the diaspora, I can be the only Sri Lankan in the room. And there are a lot of people who will kind of believe the story that the first Sri Lankan they've ever met will tell them about Sri Lanka. And I see some of you laughing with horrified recognition. So I don't love that position. I don't love people asking me, could you gloss the war in you got 30 seconds, there's a radio interview. Could you just quickly explain it?
You're in charge.
Right, and it's just that's my worst nightmare. And I also, so it's an authority that I don't want. And then also sometimes here, because of the history of diasporas and how they participated in the war, sometimes people don't actually think I should be part of the conversation, which I think is also a position that I resist, and in part resisting it through this particular story, I think. What do the two of you think about this?
I mean, the idea of the river of doubt, that you're in that quote, I love the idea that you're researching and you're kind of trying to draw together information that you might have had in the first person. And at the same time, there's this river of doubt coursing through your thoughts always. Is this authentic? Is this mine?
Yeah, there's a problem when you're also in the diaspora. Yeah, it's a problem with representation, because I think novel cannot represent something. You just tell individual stories, which are very, you have like characters, they're very unique, and it's not like the Kurdish story. It's one particular. There can also be some bigger story in it, but still, it's not like we are not like ambassadors or something. So that's also a problem somehow. And so, yeah, authenticity is. I think it's a problem. Yeah.
it seems like it often gets reduced to a question of kind of oneness. Chimamanda Adichie has spoken about the danger of the single story, and sometimes I get asked things like, if you could only recommend one book. And again, I'm so happy to be sitting in front of a crowd of book lovers who I know will read more than one book. You know, but if someone asks me that question, I'm like, maybe pick up 2, maybe 3, knock yourself out, have 4. Because all of these stories also speak to each other, of course, and of course also across national borders, which are a construction of our modern world anyway.
I mean, also, when you actually come down to it, the reading of a book is so private, and it's a communication between you and the reader. And so the ultimate authenticity is that the reader can invest in the character, and that they can say, yeah, I get this character, I felt something of this character's thoughts or this character's feelings, and I know what this feels like. And so that's our challenge as writers, really. I mean, of course we're covering all these other bigger issues, but ultimately it's down to this very personal connection between you, your characters, and the readers and your characters, because they invent the character for themselves, and ultimately you offer little milestones and little nudges to the reader's imagination, and after that, and the more authentic you are in that process, the more the reader will invest, because they will feel that authenticity. And I think that is the magic of fiction, that there is this loop that goes through, which is more real in a way than the real.
But it's also that every reader reads his or her own book somehow, or writes her own book while reading it. And it's very interesting, because when I presented the book, and some said, oh, it's a story about a family between 2 cultures. Some said, okay, it's a story about violence, affects a family somehow, or like war and whatever. And so everyone, I think, reads they said, okay, it's about a queer girl growing up in a Yazidi. So it's really, everyone reads their own book, and I think that's in poetry even more, and I really like that somehow, to hear what kind of book they read.
Well, I keep getting asked where the villa is, because people want to go and stay there, and it's completely made up. You know, it's like my grandparents' house from the, 1950s and 40s, whatever it is built, a very modern bungalow. It was the feeling of that, and the rooms from there, but transposed into my grandmother's house in Kurdish-Yazidi and other old houses I stayed in. It was complete composite. But I also was very, very careful not to give too much detail. So I added little, like windows and the odd piece of furniture, but I think the rest came from the readers, because if they've imagined this entire house that they want to go and spend time in on holiday, I mean, that's their house. They've invented the villa, which I think is wonderful.
I think the claiming of responsibility or claiming of authenticity really lies in that metaphor you brought up, the river of doubt. I think that's such a beautiful, very subjective thing that, as writers, you guys are naturally, all 3 of you, so tied to that mission of finding that authenticity for yourself, however that means. I know for Ronya, you talked about how you couldn't go back to the place. You had so many testimonials from people, so many stories that came through. All 3 of you just really, you're going after it, and you're rigorous research, not relaxed about it.
It's actually, Ronya said something quite interesting earlier on when you said that the loss structures the story, and again the idea of absence, this kind of negative space that you create an entire world from. I mean, I don't know.
Maybe it's not about the cigarette, but it's about trying and failing to make the cigarette.
That's it.
I love that cigarette.
And also
I don't
I mean, there's cigarettes all over this book, so if you like to smoke.
But also that whole idea of habit and ritual, like
the ritual.
John Berger talks about how the migrant creates home through little acts of ritual and habit, and he says something like, it could just be the way somebody wears their hat, and so this idea of the cigarettes and the rolling and the actions, that's memory, and then again the absence and the creation.
We have lots of stuff to talk about up here, clearly, but I want to make sure there's enough room for the audience. Do we have questions in the audience? Oh, there's one. There's 2 or 3. Okay, we better get the mic going. 4, my goodness. Okay, we're gonna spill over, guys. Whoever's the next session. Warning. Okay, who's first?
Hello, thank you. It's been a brilliant session again, really, really good in Colombo, but this has been, I think, better. I grew up in Scotland, and I was taught from a very, very early age that everything I ate, everything I thought, everything I sang, everything I witnessed was always superior to what people in England did. And that was just the way it was in my home. And so I want to ask a question about the danger of mythologizing home and what the writers do in order to try to combat that kind of East mythology of looking back.
So what's the danger of mythologizing home in your work? Who would like to answer to that?
In my case, I created some characters that were marked by that trait. I've got a guy called Jared in my book who loves Sri Lanka to the point of not seeing the dangers of speaking too openly about his political beliefs, and sort of doesn't read where he is. He's so idealistic, and that idealism lives in me. I mean, I love Sri Lanka so much in this kind of naive, childlike way. So it was really interesting to avoid exposing that in a book by making a character do it explicitly. So I created a vehicle for it.
That's really interesting. I also have, I think that one of the dangers of mythologizing home is ethno-nationalism. Since that's right there, I'll just go ahead and hit that target. So I think in my book, characters argue about that sometimes. And I think also that when I was writing about spaces, I tried purposely to also not just reference their past. So for example, in both of my novels actually, there are references and descriptions of the burning of the Jaffna Public Library, which was of course a horrible historical incident and is often discussed in terms of the destruction of single copy manuscripts. It was also actually a place where people studied, right? And regular community members went. And it was part of their daily lives. They read the daily newspaper there. So I tried to bring that into the story rather than sort of making it an ancient palace, which maybe it also was, but to make it a place like the library that I had gone to as a kid, where the librarians knew me because I had gone every day and asked them a lot of questions and had done my homework there. So to kind of puncture some of the myth as much as possible. How about you?
It's also, I think in the novel it's also because it's the memory of Leila, and she also questions herself because she, in one way she thinks about the village, it's like paradise, and the other it's like hell because the people were very poor, and there was in the Syrian regime was present with spies and also inside the village, so there were people spying for the regime, so it's always it's paradise and it switches in hell somehow and back and forth, and I think she also reflects my protagonist. So
okay, next question. Let's get here a few more. Is that Shahar? Ah, hi. Thanks for coming. It's going to be a good question. Get ready.
I have a question for all of you. It's a dilemma I have faced personally. I worked on a futile playbook for the President and the Prime Minister to be on the same page related to reconciliation and messaging. And one of the arguments we faced in some of the research and the feedback was that people have the right as much to memory as to forget and move on. And that sometimes it is diasporic groups or overly woke people who keep the pain alive. So we've been accused sometimes that it's important to focus more on the moments with the hand that reached out in the dark, the moments of humanity and commonality rather than those. It's cheesy and I don't have an answer, but I wonder what you would say to that.
Without getting too much into politics.
Oh yeah, sure. No, but I mean, I think that the way through it is through art and beauty, and to look to a way of bypassing the trauma. You know, I used to run storytelling circles as a kind of community project in London, and it grew from being a family thing that we did with children and their parents and with working with adults and people who'd had certain trauma in their lives, and I found that making up sort of stories, people could address their trauma but indirectly. And so, I mean, trauma, the wound doesn't need to be re-engaged with, reopened, poked at endlessly, but it can influence the story in a way that some resolution occurs. So I think communication, but in a particularly gentle and playful environment, is a way forward. I found, I learned an awful lot from this little project I ran. I had funding from the Arts Council in the UK to try and spread it to different groups, and it really showed how totally disparate people in a circle, making up stories, you know, having fun, but also dealing with quite deep psychological themes through myths and fairy tales, which hold all these things in very abstract concepts of princesses and kings and dark woods and deep rivers, and that kind of imagery helps to bypass the specifics of traumatic experience. And I think that is the way. We still have to tell the stories, but we can tell them differently in a way that doesn't hurt as much.
I think I would just, thank you for sharing about your work, that's very interesting. I guess I would mention the previous question referred to myth, and I think that the diaspora is actually also a myth that is worth puncturing, because the story of the diaspora is told in a certain way, and I think it's fair to be critical of actors in the diaspora, but that's also a story of people with many different viewpoints, and some of those viewpoints don't have as much space as others, which is worth noting. And then I think also that, I don't know, I would argue for the coexistence of memory and a focus on present life, because people find closure through memory, and so if you don't make space for memory, I think that contributes to the kind of distortion that can be problematic. So it was important to me in my book, for example, to surface stories that had, in some cases, been very intentionally erased, to give those stories some room, including when they don't have tidy conclusions or when they are not convenient to certain storytellers.
Isn't this little place, I can't help but ask this question, isn't this market that's reinvented in Toronto, isn't this a mythology also, in a way?
It's a mythology, and it's also a place where you can go to get Jaffna curry powder, which will be tasty that night.
Can we ask for one more question? I think I'm being told that we have to wrap up, but is there one more, or... I'm sorry, I didn't get to you, did you? You have something, she's got something to say.
Yeah, I just think that memory, like for life, it's maybe different, you need to forget, but I think for literature, it's like poison if you forget somehow. You need to, like whole literature is about memory somehow, or fiction is also, memory is fiction and things like that, so, yeah.
One last question? Okay. Hi.
Check.
We got you.
Now, when you write about your home, you want the reader to connect to your home. So it becomes tough as a writer, I believe, because if you have a large audience, you're writing in India or China or somewhere, you have a million audience. With a little bit of direction, they can connect to your home. When you write about smaller places, okay, we take an example like Sri Lanka. When you're talking about a sport like cricket, and somebody out there in the world does not understand the cricketing culture in Sri Lanka. See, cricket in Sri Lanka is a street culture, not a sports culture. It's a religion, but different to the rest of the world. So if you are taking people deeply connected to your home, where something very specific, you limit your audience. So what are the thoughts that run through you? You're running the risk of your final product not reaching out to a wider range.
You always have to think about your audience. Thank you for that question. I think you're thinking about your audience when you're writing every time. You think thoroughly about that one. You don't? Ronya disagrees. Let's hear it.
No, because I cannot, like, the audience is very diverse, so I cannot think. Yeah, I try to write the best novel I can write, and
That's your responsibility.
and what I try to find out what is the story about, because you don't know in the beginning sometimes, and don't know in the middle and in the end what you're doing. So, yeah.
I think one of the curious things about being interviewed about, I will plug for that, yeah. One of the curious things about being interviewed about your work is that you answer always as though you made a lot of conscious choices, but of course I'm sure there are many writers in the audience, and so much of this is subconscious terrain, and then you a little bit look at what you wrote, and you're like, oh, that was what was in my brain, that's interesting. So it can be a curious process of discovery for us as well. But you're referring to us limiting our audiences, and I think that my challenge would maybe be a little bit to readers, because, I mean, if you don't know about cricket, aren't you limiting yourself? I think in this book, there's like a little bit of, there's a little bit of contention with the notion of explanation, and who is assumed to owe others an explanation, and who is assumed to be in the audience of recipients of the explanation. So the character does direct address sometimes, and sometimes she presumes that her audience is Sri Lankan, and sometimes she presumes that they're American, and sometimes she presumes nothing at all and questions whether she's getting it wrong. I think also, just on a very basic level, make one fast point, which is to say that writing a book is really slow, and so you have to be interested in it yourself, and so the first audience is yourself, and if you're not interested, you don't make it to the end, and anyone else reading it is such icing. It's amazing to make it to the end.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be inspired. There's no way you're getting up and sitting alone at your little desk and typing away, muttering to yourself, I'm still interested in this thing. But one thing I think is voice. You know, readers connect to an authentic voice. It doesn't matter who the character is, as long as there's a note of authenticity, readers will connect. So it's the only time.
Yeah. Honest.
Yeah.
Those questions, those
it's the only time that you can actually know what somebody is thinking is when you're reading about a character's thoughts. It's the only time you can actually know. So that is the connection, really, that we, as readers, we have with the book, and as writers, you know, we can connect too with these characters and actually know what they're thinking because we're thinking it with them in a way. So I think voice is the reason why you can connect with literally anyone as long as that voice is authentic.
Yes. Okay, thank you. I have my little son here in the very front had a tiny question. I don't know what it is. Did you have a question? Because we have to say goodbye. What's your question, Leo? On the spot? No more question? Okay, you can ask it to me later. Thank you guys. You've been a wonderful audience. Thanks to you guys. You guys are amazing. I wish we could continue on the conversation. All of the books we have, well, the Summers isn't available, but I guess they can get it. The Trixler version of Ronya's book, The Summers, is available. Brotherless Night is at Sarasabi, also at the bookstore here, and Amanthi's beautiful places here, as well as The Ordinary Chaos of Being Human is here as well. And we'll be back there for signings.
Actually, anybody bought the book there?
Oh, if you bought a book there.
But they ran out of books there. You can get the book here now.
Thank you.